I moved into a new house after my divorce. Something was wrong from the first night. It took me 6 weeks to find out what. Hello, guys. Today I want to tell you a story that honestly messed with my head. So sit back, get comfortable, and prepare yourselves. I want to be very clear about something before I start. I am not a person who believes in things that go bump in the night. I'm an engineer. I think in systems and logic and measurable outcomes. So when I tell you that for 6 weeks I was convinced my new house was doing something to me, I need you to understand how hard it was to admit that. And when I tell you what was actually happening, I need you to understand that what I found was so much worse than a ghost, so much worse than anything I could have imagined in those 6 weeks of thinking I was losing my mind. My name is Greg. I'm 41. I moved into the house in September. A rental, 3 bedrooms, more space than one person needs, but cheaper per square foot than anything smaller in that part of Portland, because the owner was motivated to rent, and I was motivated to get out of my previous situation. And those two motivations aligned. The house was built in 1974. Nothing architecturally unusual about it. 2 stories, a finished basement I planned to use as an office, a yard I did not plan to maintain because I was in no emotional state to maintain a yard. The landlord was a man named Gerald, who lived 2 states away and communicated exclusively by email in a way that suggested he found all human interaction faintly inconvenient. The house had sat empty for 4 months before I took it. The first night, I slept badly. I attributed this to sleeping in a new place, the specific alertness of an unfamiliar environment, the way every small sound registers differently when you don't yet know the baseline of a house. I had a history of light sleeping, and this seemed like a reasonable explanation. The second night, I slept worse. The third night, I didn't sleep at all. By the end of the first week, I had a list. I'm an engineer. When something doesn't work, I make a list. Here is what was on it. 1. I was waking up with headaches every morning. Not mild headaches, the heavy, pressing kind that sit behind your eyes and don't fully lift until noon. I attributed this to the bad sleep. 2. I felt, in the house, a persistent low-level unease I couldn't localize. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling of being watched, which I recognized as irrational, and which did not go away when I recognized it as irrational. 3. The basement office, where I was spending most of my working hours, felt worse than the rest of the house. The unease was heavier down there. The headaches were worse after a morning in the basement. I started working upstairs instead and felt marginally better, which I noted. 4. I was having vivid, strange dreams on the nights I did sleep. Not nightmares exactly. More like dreams with a quality of wrongness I couldn't describe precisely. I would wake from them with the feeling that something important had happened that I couldn't remember. By week 2, I had started to think about the previous tenant. The house had been empty for 4 months. Why had it been empty? I emailed Gerald asking, as casually as I could manage, whether the previous tenant had left voluntarily. Gerald replied 3 days later saying the previous tenant had relocated for work. He did not elaborate. I noticed he had not said where they had relocated to. By week 3, I started to think I was being watched, not metaphorically. Actually watched. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I know how it sounds. I am an engineer. I do not believe in things I cannot measure. What I can tell you is that twice in week 3, I had the specific physical sensation of someone standing behind me, and when I turned around, the room was empty. Both times in the basement. Both times in the late afternoon, when the light through the small basement windows went flat and gray. I stopped going to the basement entirely after the second time. Week 4. I found the marks. They were on the inside of the basement door. Small, regular, arranged in groups of 5. 4 vertical lines and 1 diagonal. The universal counting system that prisoners use in movies. I stood in the doorway, looking at them for a long time. There were a lot of them. I counted. It took a while. When I finished, I had a number that I am going to share with you because I think it matters. 219. 219 marks on the inside of the basement door. I took photographs. I sent them to my brother, who is not an engineer but who is practical and not easily rattled. He called me within 10 minutes of receiving them and said, "Greg, get out of that house." I did not get out of that house. I am an engineer. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. That was week 4. In week 5, I found the second thing. It was in the basement. I had gone back down, in the middle of the day, with every light on and my phone in my hand and the front door propped open because I am an engineer, but I am not an idiot. In the corner of the basement, behind the water heater, was a gap in the drywall. Not large, maybe 18 inches wide. The kind of gap that happens when drywall is improperly finished and then painted over and then, over time, separates at the seam. I shone my phone flashlight into the gap. There was a space behind the drywall, not large, maybe 2 feet deep, running along the back wall of the basement. And in that space, there were things, personal things. A blanket, folded, an empty water bottle, a small pile of what appeared to be food wrappers, and something else, a notebook, spiral-bound, cover worn with handling. I reached in and took the notebook. I sat down on the basement floor with every light on and my front door propped open, and I read it. And that is when I understood what had been happening in my house for 6 weeks. The notebook belonged to a person whose name I will not share here, because what I found was not a story to be shared carelessly, and the person involved deserves whatever privacy remains available to them. What I can tell you is this. Someone had been living in the space behind my basement wall. Not before I moved in, not just during the 4 months the house was empty. While I was living there, the notebook had entries dated from the week before. I moved in through. The date on the last entry was 11 days before I found it. The entries were not the writings of someone unstable or dangerous. They were careful, observational. The notes of a person managing a precarious situation with considerable intelligence. The person knew my schedule. They knew when I left in the morning and when I came home. They knew I had stopped going to the basement and had noted, with what read as relief, that this made things easier. They knew my name, Greg. It appeared several times in the entries, not threateningly, just as information. The name of the person whose house this now was, the headaches. I had been sleeping in a house with compromised air quality because a person living in a sealed space behind a wall was affecting the ventilation in ways I had not understood. An engineer should have thought of this sooner. I had not thought of this sooner because I had been thinking about ghosts, the feeling of being watched. I had been watched. Through the gap in the drywall, through the spaces in a house that a person living invisibly learns to use. I had been watched every day for 6 weeks by someone who needed to know my patterns to stay safe. The marks on the door. 219 marks. Days. Not the 4 months the house had been empty. Longer than that. Much longer. I sat on the basement floor for a long time. Then I did something that I have thought about many times since and that I believe was the right decision, though I understand not everyone would make it. I did not call the police. I went upstairs. I made 2 sandwiches. I put them on a plate with a glass of water. I carried them to the basement door. I set them on the floor just inside the doorway. I said out loud to the empty basement, "I found the notebook. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. There's food here. I'm going upstairs. I think we should talk if you're willing, but only if you're willing." Then I went upstairs and I sat at my kitchen table and I waited. 40 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. I am not going to tell you everything about the person I met that evening. What I will tell you is that they were not dangerous. They were exhausted and frightened and had been in that house, in that space, for a period of time that explained the 219 marks and that I am still not fully able to process. They had nowhere to go. They had found the empty house and found the gap in the basement wall and had made a calculation that a person in their situation makes, that invisible and warm was better than visible and exposed. We talked for 2 hours at my kitchen table. I made more food. I did not ask questions that felt like interrogation. I asked questions that felt like conversation, which is a distinction that matters enormously when someone has been invisible for a very long time and is trying to decide whether the person across from them is safe. By the end of the conversation, I had made 2 calls. One to a social services organization I found by searching on my phone while the person across from me watched carefully to make sure I was doing what I said I was doing. One to my brother, who drove over and said nothing unhelpful, which is the best thing you can do in a situation you don't fully understand. The person was connected with services that night. I will not say more than that because it is not my story to tell further. What I will say is that I heard, 3 months later through the organization I had called, that things were better, not fixed, better, which is how most real things improve. I patched the basement wall. I repainted it. The marks on the door I left. I'm not sure why. Maybe because 219 days is a long time to survive something, and that deserves to be acknowledged somewhere, even if only on the inside of a door in a basement in Portland that most people will never see. I still live in the house. The basement is my office now, and the headaches are gone, and the feeling of being watched is gone, and most nights I sleep fine. What I think about, sometimes, is the 6 weeks I spent being frightened of something I couldn't understand, and how the thing I was frightened of turned out to be a person. Just a person, doing what people do when they have no other options, surviving, quietly, in the spaces that other people don't look at. I was scared of a ghost. There was no ghost. There was just someone who needed help and didn't know how to ask for it. I think about that a lot. If this one stayed with you, let it. The scariest things usually aren't what we think they are. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is put food on a plate and say, I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice. I'm here if you want to talk. If you made it to the end, thank you. Drop a like if this hit different. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.